and 1,200 gospel movements are going on, and they're somewhere in one of these four phases. So this is happening somewhere in the world right now. Also, what I want to share with you, as we walk through this, if you're a good church historian, you're going to notice the history of several major Protestant denominations as we walk through this. So is that fair? All right. So let me just start off with this, and what I want you to do, and this is going to get a little conversational here. I want you to put 0 to 1 right here. All right. So let me ask you all a question. If you were dropped into a context where there were no churches, at least observable churches, you were dropped into a place somewhere in the world, it could be in the United States, where you are, what would be some of the first things you would do if you were just dropped in as a believer and your job was to get a church going there? What are some of the things you would first do? What are, just right off the top of your head, what would you do?
Connect with the community.
Connect, who said that? Connect with the community? Just get out there, okay?
Listen to people.
What's that?
Listen to people.
Listen to people. You start observing, things like that, right? Anybody else?
Try to learn the needs of the community.
Try to learn the needs. So you're kind of, like he said, observe things, right? Okay.
Prayer walk.
Huh?
Prayer walk.
Prayer walk. That's always a good thing to do. Yeah, prayer and fasting, right? You're desperate, right? Anybody else? Anything?
Share the gospel.
Boy, there's a good idea. I tell you what, yeah.
It sounds so obvious.
You're not a plant, but yeah. So these are great. So it does beg the question in the missions: if you were dropped into a part of the world where you know nothing, and there's no believers, what would you do? So prayer, start observing, picking up, learning the culture, all those good things. But what I want to share with you in the beginning of a movement, what we have is, I'm going to put a guy right here at the bottom. I want you to draw a guy. This is you or a gal. And we're going to put this as an outsider. Okay? You're an outsider coming into a culture. Okay? So the first thing we have is an outsider. It can be a group of people or a person who comes into that culture. Is that fair? And I think all those things that you guys said, I'm going to start praying. I'm going to start observing. But what I want to stress at some point, to that lady's example, at some point you're going to have to start sharing the gospel. The message of the kingdom has to start ringing. Is that fair? So at some point we got to share the message of the kingdom. And so what we do is, this guy or gal, what needs to be happening at some point is that they need to start sharing the gospel. So I'm going to start putting little seeds around this guy. All right? Somehow. So what we're going to put here is this seed is gospel sharing needs that start happening at some point. Okay? Are we good? All right, cool. So what we have is we have an outsider coming into a new area. Is that fair? This is kind of the freakonomics of the kingdom. And so that outsider, whether he's observing, doing whatever, he starts sharing the gospel a lot. Okay? Or somehow he's getting the message of the kingdom out there. Is that fair? Now here's where it gets interesting. This outsider, at some point, whether through gospel sharing or through conversations, eventually finds or eventually has their first convert. Does that make sense? Or their first person of peace, or their first house of peace. Somehow they connect with somebody, and this person is the first believer, the first house of peace, whatever that may be. Now, let me ask you guys something. What do you do with that guy or gal that you have that receives the message or receives what you're doing? What would you intuitively do with this person? You think? Yeah, you would immediately start hanging out with. You wouldn't leave them, give them a Bible, hope everything works out, right? You would want to spend time with this person, right? A lot of time. Now, intuitively, you want to disciple them. What do you want that person to begin doing? You want them to be sharing the gospel, right? Yeah. So what we're going to do is, I'm spending time with this one individual, whoever it may be, and I hope in a matter of time, this person or house begins doing what right around them? they start sharing the gospel. Does this make sense? And guess what happens around this person that's going to happen a lot quicker than it happened around you? They're going to eventually have somebody that comes to the Lord, or they find another house of peace, and it starts to begin to happening quicker around this person. So what I want you to see here is that gospel sharing is robust at this point. It's just, there's a lot of gospel sharing. And eventually what you have, we hope, and this is going to sound very simplistic, is eventually you have your first gathering right here. Does this make sense? You have a very simple gathering, right? And so what happens is over time, you eventually have another one maybe over here. You have a gathering that begins to happen over here, and you begin to do the same thing. The gospel, you're beginning to cycle these people quickly to begin to share the gospel and to begin to make disciples, and they begin to gather. And what you have in these is these simple gatherings. Okay? Simple gatherings. The other thing I want you to note here also, I want you to start to put an arrow that goes up like this. And I want you to put authority as high, the giving authority, and the priesthood of the believer is high. Because you're having to give stuff away. You cannot bottleneck it with yourself. Does that make sense? You're giving baptism away. Just things are being given away because you have to. Does this make sense? So this is a key insider. Eventually this group begins to multiply, right? This group multiplies, they get to another one, and then robust gospel sharing is happening. All the gospel sharing, for the most part, is happening outside the group or in the marketplace. And then you have another group that begins from that one. You guys see where we're going with this? And they begin to multiply. Then, this is kind of the inflection point. I want you to put a star right here, all right? And then I want you to put, on this one, I want you to put movement at the top, right here. And then I want you to put a dotted line down the middle. The inflection point between 0 to 1 in movement is when you have a fourth generation church and it's almost totally indigenous at this point. Does that make sense? Indigenous. So the outsider is not pushing this through. They're not. We see this in churches. When it begins to take, you're not having to prime the pump, and then this fourth generation group, it's on its own. It's running on its own field. Does that make sense? Any questions so far? All right. So now we're into the movement phase, and so the inflection point or the gold standard of a movement is when you're a fourth generation church and it's totally indigenous. So what would begin to happen here is gospel sharing begins to really take off. So I want you to put a bunch of dots here, all right? So I want you to put an arrow. Gospel sharing is robust. The gatherings are still very simple at this point. And they're just multiplying out. Mind you, again, this could take 25 years. This could take 30 years. This could take 10 years. And they're multiplying out. You guys see this? So now we're at 6 and 7 generations, multiple streams of groups. So gospel sharing is high. The other thing so we have simple churches, because there's no buildings at this point, simple churches. Also, leadership is very simple. It's not been formalized yet. There's not a lot of education. It's just simple. Everything at this point is very, very simplistic. Priesthood and authority are also high. You know what? When we say that, when we say that, what that means? You're shaking your head. Does anyone else know what I mean by that? Let me give you an example. Baptism. I mentioned that. Who can baptize in most of our churches?
Pastors.
Right. Who's given the authority to baptize in the Bible? Huh? No, who gave the authority to baptize? Who did he give it to? No? Everyone. That's right. That's right. So authority, we're not bottlenecking authority. Things are being given away. Anybody can start a church. We can start a church anywhere. Baptism is being given away. So things are not bottlenecked through leadership. Does this make sense? Because it has to be simple. So also what we see here, also most of the training is happening inside the group, is happening in these groups. The other thing about leadership, one of the predominant leaders that's emerging at this time is what we call the apes. You guys know what I mean when I say apes?
Apostle.
Prophet, evangelist. This leadership group is very prominent at this point. They are they're very upfront. Trying to think of other words I see. There is also with leadership. There's no what you call clergy laity divide. You just don't have that at this point. So the gospel sharing is very high. Groups are multiplying. They are messy, and they're meeting in all kinds of places: homes, informal places. Also, down here at the bottom, I didn't do this. I want you to put a little box. I want you to put the word persecution. Persecution is high. So somewhere in the middle of the movement, things begin to transition. We begin to have informal buildings and meeting places. All right, I'm just going to put that there. Not a lot, but some. Gospel sharing is still high. It's happening out in the marketplace. I want you to notice we're kind of working our way up here. Priesthood of the believer is still relatively high. They're giving things away. Authority is being given away. Doctrine begins to formalize. Leadership begins. Also, with the leaders, we start to see on this backside, we see the emergence of the STs. You know what that means? Shepherd teachers. So we begin to see shepherd teachers show up over here a little bit more. The shepherd teachers, which is part of the, if you notice here, this is part of the Ephesians 4:11 gift set. So we begin to see shepherd teachers emerging on the back, on the other side of movements. They're in here, but they become much more prominent. So, I know this seems kind of Does this make sense? Any questions at this point? Yes.
What's PH stand for?
Priesthood of the believer. Priesthood. Authority, those kind of go hand in hand. We see people as priests, right? They have the authority to go, to share the gospel, to make disciples, and even in some cases start churches. Yes?
So the 8 started to emerge, I think, in the middle, and then SQ, right? So who is that in the first person that wrote?
This guy right here?
Right.
Yeah, that's a great question. What do you think they are?
Evangelist.
They're an evangelist? Okay, what is an evangelist?
They're more to proclaim the gospel.
Okay, where do we get the description of an evangelist in the New Testament? Huh? Nope. Evangelist shows up 3 times in Scripture. It shows up in Acts chapter 23-ish about Philip. It shows one other time in Ephesians 4.
Just uses the word without defining it.
No. We get a definition of what they're doing. The other place it shows up is with Timothy, where Paul tells him to do the work of evangelism. The one place we get some, now we can obviously deduce that Philip was an evangelist, right? But in Ephesians 4:11, the evangelist is to do what?
Equip the saints for the
Exactly. They are to equip the saints to do the work. Now, it presupposes they are doing the work. I would hate to think that there's an evangelist that's not really doing the work. That would be a little bit hypocritical. But the evangelist is to equip the church to do the work, not to do the work all for them. Okay? Major difference. So we think, but by the way, this is where we get a lot of really fuzzy thinking. I get this everywhere I train. I don't have the gift of evangelism. I'm like, good. You don't. It's much more than that. It's your identity. You're an ambassador. So this guy or gal, most likely, in my humble, and there's one sitting right back here, they're a pioneering type. They're an apostolic type. They want to go where the gaps are. Does this make sense? Even in your own community. So by the way, this guy or gal is huge in the whole process. They're massive. Who kicks this whole thing off? This apostolic pioneer type. By the way, it's my opinion that these people are sitting in our church and they're dormant because they're sitting under bad leadership. Does not have a big vision. So these are the guys and gals, and we work with them. They look at their community and they're like, there's no one over here reaching it. We got this gap over here. We have no church over here. There's no one reaching the Muslims. There's no one we find these people. They're in the church. They're sitting there. And so this outsider, and by the way, we see this also in our communities here. They're the ones that go into a place where there's a gap and they begin the apostolic pioneering work. So this person is very critical, or these group of people. Does that make sense? So they kick the whole thing off. This thing starts to take a life on its own. By the way, again, this could be 15, 20 years. This thing starts to spread. We see the emergence of other apes who begin to do the same pioneering work. Leadership simple. Training is happening inside the group. Gospel sharing is robust. It's totally indigenous. And then we begin to get on the other side of the movement, and we begin to see a full. We begin to see a sweet spot between the apes. We see the apostolics, the prophetics, the evangelists, shepherd, teachers. We see this real sweet spot starting to happen. We start to see the formalization of buildings in there. Doctrine begins to solidify. And then we go to the next one. This is going to make more and more sense as we get forward. The next one is formalization. And what happens is, in this one, now what we see is still have simple buildings and simple fellowships, churches, but what we begin to see in formalization, almost exclusively, we begin to see formalized buildings beginning to emerge. Gospel sharing, so I'm going to put formal church buildings begin to emerge. with leadership, we see all kinds of things begin to happen. One of the things that begins to happen is we begin to see that these churches are led by star teachers. So we see the emergence of star teachers, and that's the predominant leadership in the church. The other thing that begins to start to wane, by the way, almost all of the gatherings now are in formalized buildings. Gospel sharing begins to slow down. It's starting to taper off. It's not happening out in the marketplace like it used to. Where do you think the gospel sharing is starting to move to?
Inside the church?
That's exactly, it's starting to move inside a building. So we see leadership begins to formalize too. We begin to see education, credentialing, ordination, right? You guys get where we're going with this?
We're working towards high church.
We're getting there. Yeah.
We're going from barefoot in someone's living room.
Yeah. So by the way, this isn't all bad. This is also what we begin to see starting to wane is the priesthood and the authority is beginning to be pulled back. Why do you think that's beginning to happen, guys?
Differences in doctrine and doctrinal differences, maybe among the members when they
Possibly.
They get too big, they say have conversations, and you go out and they're preaching something different. And it's like,
So you feel like, oh, we got to control it, right? Okay, yeah, that's actually good. That's an interesting observation. Yeah, we want to control what's starting to happen.
Well, our credentials protect. I mean, there can be a pure motive in that. Centralization of that authority and voice of who can and who does guard. How do we watch over these things?
Yeah. Well, we got leaders who can do it now. Why not let them do it? We see this across the board, right? We're starting to, by the way, what also gets introduced into this, somewhere it gets introduced, is money. These guys start getting paid. And man, the day that starts, things really get wonky. Not wonky, but you get the picture. So also, like I said, teachers are dominating at this point. I'm trying to think of I broke down several. Oh, this is important. If you could put a box right here, just at the top, and I want you to put cultural transformation really begins to happen. Transformation or equity. The church begins to be bringing value to the culture. They see this movement. It's not a movement anymore. They see that this is really starting to impact the culture in a significant way. The other thing we begin to see is that these churches begin to coalition together. So we begin to see coalitions, and that could be around doctrine, leaders, or geographic. So they begin to come together, right? Does this make sense? So we begin to see coalitions of churches coming together. And then they start building institutions. Orphanages, seminaries, hospitals, schools. Does that make sense? So they begin to formalize, and they begin to produce institutions. And by the way, this is the cultural impact at this point is significant. This is where, in the United States, you start to get tax-exempt status. Yes?
But also, I was going to say, I think it's implicit, but the money and the way it's being directed is changing. There might have been
money back here.
Money there.
Yeah.
It's just being completely redirected.
Yep.
That's what we do.
Yep. Oh, yeah, there's money back here, but now it's a whole different, that would be something to ask Nathan. The role of money in all of this is huge. So now we're at formalization, and you're going to be starting to recognize where you live right now. The last place is, I want you to, I'll do blue, institutionalization. All right, now, what we begin, I'm going to put one gospel here. Gospel sharing is totally, it's moved in almost exclusively into the building. All the gospel sharing is moved into a localized building. So gospel sharing is almost non-existent. It leaks out in the marketplace. By the way, I'm an expert in this because this is where I've lived, worked, and played for the last 30 years. So this is where I feel most comfortable describing this. This is me. So all the gospel sharing is moved into place. Leadership now is totally formalized. You have to be educated. They're generally bringing leaders outside of the church in to lead the church. The leaders are not being raised up within the church. Does this make sense? So leadership is totally formalized. And you have to have a degree from FDTS. You get the picture? We see the emergence in this, somewhere in here, I'm going to put 2 blocks of the mega church. Oh, by the way, leadership is totally led by teachers at this point. Star teachers are all, right? Star teachers who are leading these churches. Also, this is a little bit of an overstatement, but most of the aides have exited the church and are now doing paraministries. Because they don't have a place at the table anymore. We call apes now missionaries. So Neil Cole tells me, I've actually had a conversation with Neil. He said the first major pastor that led an apostolic at the table was Rick Warren. So these guys and gals are not at the table anymore. Now they're out starting paraministries. They have this place called the Hope Center, and they go outside the church to begin doing what we should have been doing with the church. Most of the baptisms in this world are by their children we're baptizing now. We're not baptizing a bunch of adults. It's children. My church is a great example. The year I left, we did 45 baptisms the year before. 39 of them were under the age of 12. Does this make sense? Also, the institutions that we've created, the seminaries, are now, for the most part, producing star teachers. Because that's what the church is asking for. Also, all the training in the church has now been delegated to an institution. Does that make sense? Doctrine is highly advanced. In fact, most of the believers in this world have more doctrinal training than the leaders in this world. The major evangelistic strategy here, I'm really going off, is come and see rather than go and tell. High resources. This is the gold standard. They have high resources. Cultural transformation is peaking at this point. The community sees what's happening in this building as having value. Trying to think of some other things that happen in this world. By the way, this is where we live now. Would you agree? For the most part. There's a lot, and by the way, I told you there's going to be a lot of generalizations, right? And broad brush statements. I'm going to stop here. It's messy. But this is generally how movements progress through the world. Any questions or observations before we go to some conclusions? Yes?
I feel like It's really my experience because I became a Christian in one of these stage 1 or stage 2.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, and just being in an evangelical church, I feel like this describes a lot of the evangelical world. You can see all 4 stages. You know, you go to some of these apartment complexes, and this stage 1.
You might be in this stage. There's pockets of this, yeah.
All across the street, there's a cathedral.
Isn't that the cool part about some parts of the United States? You can be in different places depending on.
I also know that at every stage, there's value that what God is doing, because there's not much cultural transformation going on here, but there sure is here. But over here, everybody is sharing the gospel. And here, everyone's like saying, well, come to church and you'll hear the gospel.
Yeah, to some degree. Yeah. I like what you said, that you can literally be in this world, and then across the street, this is going on. That's a good point. Yeah. Other observations? Yes, sir.
It appears to me, or essentially rather, that this is true not just of things of gospel movement, but of like heretical movements as well. Like whenever I call my Metro PCS, my phone service, I get someone in the Philippines, and we always have a conversation, and I was like, well, what's the gospel like? What kind of churches? And they said, oh, we have everything. And so we have Mormons, we have this, we have that.
Yeah.
And I was like, and she said I was like, how did that start? She said, missionaries. So missionaries from the Mormon church, they came and eventually they become institutionalized, and each denomination eventually becomes institutionalized. So I'm wondering, like,
That is a trajectory of a lot of, this is,
beyond in the secular world, for that matter, right?
yeah.
They'll move and trend toward institutionalization, socialization, authority, and power.
grassroots compared to
Exactly.
institutionalized organizations.
And either way, then we're talking about the eventual cooling, shifting of values. I appreciate the comment. There's value from the front. There's value in each of these phases.
Absolutely.
Transformation that we've not been praying for. I promise you, we're praying for when we're being persecuted at the beginning of that work.
Yeah.
So what are the trappings also?
That's a great point. Each of these has value, has significant value. Now, here's where it gets interesting for me, is when you take people in this world and you drop them over here. I'll give you an example. Let me just give you an example. We had a guy get up at church. We're working with some local church here. I was in the worship center. It's called J Life. They're out of Africa, and he's telling stories to this church about this stuff. Okay, they started like 50 hut churches in a matter of about a year, and we're all clapping. And he's describing this world, and we're clapping about this. Does this make sense? And so I went up to the pastor afterwards, or one of the pastors. I go, "Hey, do you think we could do this? What he's talking about over here?" And he looked at me like I had a third eye. Is that possible to have both worlds side by side? There's a buddy of mine right now who's doing a doctoral dissertation on this. His name is Joe Stewart. He's going to Cairo, Egypt. He's doing his doc. Can we do this world inside this world? I've been trying to do that for the last 8 years, and it's an interesting venture. Yes, ma'am, you're going to say something.
So now, we have a lot more globalization than we.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a good point.
So kind of in the second stage, I feel like, here at DTS, very institutionalized. We do have a lot of international students that are coming from these other phases to learn to then go back. So now
which is interesting, isn't it?
Is the phases.
Well, here, and these guys back here, you got some real living examples sitting back here. But what happens when you take a guy or gal and you drop them over in this world? We do this all the time. And then we take them back and we drop them back into this world. And we put institutional expectations on a movement world. It's a good way to kill it, I think. We do this all the time. We want to build buildings. By the way, this is just from what I've been told, when you drop into this world and you start throwing money into this world to build buildings,
Right.
you think you're helping it, right? And they want that because they saw this and they want this over here.
Right.
And by the way, just to be honest with you, I want to learn from these guys. I want to humble myself and go, what can we learn from the people that are doing this? How can we learn from them? But for the last 100 years, we've been the white guy that's got all the answers, and we're going to tell the other people on the other side of the world how to do church when we should be listening to them. We have to humble ourselves. This is what happened to me 8 years ago. Guys over here came over to my church, and I started doing this stuff inside this realm. Let me tell you what happens. It creates tension.
Right.
Immediately. Now, I want to show you rainbows and unicorns, but when you take these principles and practices and drop them into this world, it does two things. It creates immediate tension and resistance, and it creates spiritual health. It creates church health. Now, you're not going to go and, I'm not saying it's going to be a church planning, you're going to see all this. That happens in time. But what we're trying to do is take people in this world, and they're sensing the gap. I'm telling you. They're like, it's got to be more than sitting in a small group and sitting in a worship service. And we take them for about 8 hours. They're in this world, and we drop them into this world. That's what we do in our gospel conversation training. That's what Joe's doing on Saturday. We physically train them, and then we drop them into their community. And what you're going to find, this is in Dallas, we drop them into this area, we start acting like these people, and it's amazing how many people in our communities know nothing about Jesus.
Wow.
By the way, a lot of the people that are coming into our community from India, I'm a minority in my neighborhood. You know what world they're coming out of? They're coming out of this world, even if they're not believers. Does this make sense? And so we're going to have to institute these techniques to reach a whole group of people that are coming into our backyard, because the come and see approach is not going to work. I'm telling you, it'll work with existing Christians really well, or nominal Christians. It's not going to work with the Hindu and the Muslim or those who are far from God. Someone's got to physically go get them, like what's happening here. Does that make sense? All right, I did a lot of talking. Observations or questions or pushback?
We're gonna slip out and head toward.
Yes.
I wish I could hear the rest of the observations. One of them is on the right side of the graph, there are at times institutions who catch a vision for it and bring people to talk on a whiteboard about and why.
This guy right here, I know this guy's been living in this world for 20 years.
You guys are studying that at an amazing institution who's challenging and not afraid to ask some of the questions about its own purpose and validity and sustainability for the sake of the kingdom. This is a pretty sweet time to be in this classroom.
I think God's moving. So the $1 million question is, what happens after institutionalism? Right? What happens? But let me say this much: if every movement of God right now landed here, this would be a good thing. Jesus would come back. I mean, it's not a bad, I'm not knocking that. There's wonderful things about this. We just need to call it for what it is. Any more observations? So I talk about what's next. Oh, yes.
So, I'm from India.
What part?
Mumbai.
Oh, Mumbai. Okay.
And we have mission work spread across the country in a few interior villages. So I've been telling my friends who pray for me, who financially support me, I've been telling them that we don't need to send our people to a place like DTS back in India, to send them to a place like this, spend thousands of rupees. Why not we train our own pastors to train their own next level leaders?
That's where the training is happening, localized.
But I'm thinking, as you said in the beginning, everything from the West has been so much commercialized, so everyone dreams of converting the movement into an institution. And they don't want to do what what actually we want to do now. Their eyes are not opening up. And so they want to send everyone to a Bible seminary, and then once you finish seminary, you ask the guy, do you want to go back? He says, no, my village doesn't have a toilet, my village doesn't have electricity, there's no water, I don't want to go back.
That's the problem. That's the other thing of taking someone over here, dropping them into an institution over here, getting trained. They don't want to go back because this is pretty nice. This is a good gig. Yes, sir.
I think this is great. Thank you for sharing us the most effective way maybe for churches or body of Christ to be successful. And at the current state, I think what I'm seeing is, if I can put it in kind of like a diagram, it's like a dino, and we don't have many people on the left, like very little, and it gets bigger in the middle to the second or third, and then very little in the fourth. I believe that what we should be doing is training the guy and gal on the left. I need 1 billion of those.
These?
Right.
Yeah. That's
So I believe this, the phase number 2 should be training people like that guy.
So here's, I appreciate it. This is what our organization is about. What we're trying to do is to find this guy or gal who's willing to do this locally. By the way, I'm not going to ever pay you to do something you won't do for free. This person, they're here. And what we do is we do all of this activity. Guess where we do this activity first before we go somewhere else and do it? Do it where you know the language, you know the culture. Why would I pay you? Why would I fund you to do something in Timbuktu you're unwilling or for whatever reason have never done or even, by the way, I want you to fail at this a lot.
Yeah.
We always say you have the right to fail. You do not have the right to flounder.
Wow.
So what I'm doing is I'm going to local churches and going, one of the things we're doing is finding these people and going, hey, let's do it locally. Let's do it in your neighborhood. Let's find a spot and let's run the play here. And guess what ends up happening to this guy or gal? Sometimes they're the ones you want to send overseas. They're the ones you want to put money on and fund them because they've shown faithfulness where they are now.
Yeah.
What if I walk, I live in Dallas, I live right down the street from the Star. You guys know where the Star is? That's where the Cowboys practice. What if I knocked on the door? And I said, hey, I want to play football. And they're like, well, okay, who are you? But first, if I don't know who you are, problem one.
Yeah.
People come to us, oh, I want to do this. I'm like, where are you? And I want to get paid. I'm like, where have you been? This happens about once a month to us. We're like, they get raptured and like, just. And so I walk up to the Star, I go, hey, I want to play football. And they're like, okay, well, tell me your credentials. I go, I've read a lot about it. I've read a lot about football. I've got a nerd football, and I've been practicing in my backyard. And they're like, okay. Yeah, once you come onto the team, we're going to pay. No way would you do that. But what we're trying to do with these outsiders is they are here. We're finding that they're latent. They're kind of layered underneath stuff. But the way we find these outsiders, we begin training the church, and they begin to emerge. Does that make sense? They're there. The evangelist, the apostle, the prophet. These apes begin to emerge through obedience, not through teaching. Does this make sense? Yes, ma'am.
Does this phase have to happen? Like you talk about Nathan has been where he is.
That guy that kept his mouth shut should have been teaching this.
Or has this happened in his area?
No, I would say Nathan has been right here for about 25 years.
Yes.
Okay, there are movements in India and Bihar that have been in a movement state phase for 30 years. You know why? You know what keeps it in movement is persecution. Let me give you a case study. China. I don't know how many of you are aware. China in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the church was beginning to formalize in leadership. The government was recognizing it, and guess what? This thing called Tiananmen Square happened. It was more than that. And basically, the church was beginning to formalize in China, and guess what happened? the church came down and the government stomped it down and pushed it back into movement. They were moving in this direction fast in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Government comes in, stamps it down, goes into movement phase, and flourishes. Does this make sense? So there's examples. So the worst thing to do is to take away the persecution, right? I mean, that's what keeps it in the movement, right? And so a lot more I can say about that. Any more observations? So I got 10 minutes. I got 5 minutes. What happens after this, right? So we don't know. Well, yes, we do. We do a little bit. Can I move this? You know what? Let's do this. This is not part of the presentation. This is my own little. So what I think in post-institutional church, which is a couple things happen. This is just anecdotal. Please don't start a new church about what I'm about to say. But what begins to happen is, remember that cultural equity thing really begins to wane. Cultural equity, the community, the culture, it does not, they see less and less value in the institutional church. It doesn't bring back, does that make sense? We're seeing that now. You start to lose tax property back. You don't have tax-free property. Yeah, pastors don't get housing allowances anymore. We're already starting to see this in California and outlying areas in New York. We're losing. They look at that building. That brings no value to our community anymore. Does this make sense? So cultural equity begins to wane, and what begins to happen is the persecution begins to ramp up. And they kind of go hand in hand, right? Because you're not seeing as value, and you know what? The news starts, right? Does this make sense? And I'm not talking about like open persecution. It's just subtle things. Like I said, you lose your tax-exempt status. Radio stations that you start to feel the ratcheting down. Does this make sense? So there's loss of privilege. Let me say this much. As the cultural equity goes, you start to cave on doctrine. And I don't want to say this is all bad. And what happens is you have pockets of movement stuff starting to happen because now you're reverting back to them, and you start doing movement practices. You start meeting in simple places that are under the radar. By the way, we were here for about 3 months during COVID, guys. We were told we couldn't go in our buildings. So we start to see signs of this. So I'll just end that. There's a lot more I can say. Also, the immigration begins to impact this a lot because most of the people that are coming into your communities and urban centers are coming from an area of the world where they're in a movement phase. So we have to revert back to movement principles and practices if we're going to make an impact on those people. Does that make sense? Any questions? I threw a lot at you. Agree, disagree? Anyone want to start an argument? Fight? No. Anything?
Somebody once told me that the progression of the gospel as it's moved from east to west has been missionary, then movement, then memorial. Yeah.
Well, what you're talking about, this is actually what I showed you. Were you guys here last year when the professor from Southeastern came? This is exactly what he showed, and he put words to this. He said this was actually you become a mortician. Do you guys remember? Go watch it. What's his name? Where's your mom? Oh, I forgot his name. He just escapes me now. But the guy who did chapel last year basically spoke on this. I think it was this past year. What's his name? He's from Southeast. Any rate, he took that and then just played with it a little bit more and stuff like that. So, any questions or observations? Anything online? Yes.
So
So how do we continue with this conversation? Like, if we want to talk, if we want to have
Yeah. So the best way to continue this conversation is to drop into some of our trainings locally. And so, in fact, you can scan that right there, or you can email me. The better thing, man, is not to get into a conversation, is to get into practice. Because there's, what I found, to be honest with you, there's a lot of people that love to talk about this until we turn blue in the face. What I'm trying to find is practitioners and people that will begin to do some of that movement practices where they live. So I'll give you my email, ross.ramsey at e3partners.org. So a little bit of background, I tried all this stuff at a local church. I was on staff at a church of about 1,000 people. We started instituting these principles. That was what I told that story on Tuesday, or some of it, very brief part, of us beginning to implement some of this stuff locally. And it was an adventure. Questions, observations, anything else? Is that it? Any?
On that website, we'll see schedule of the training.
We'll get your name. There's a training this Saturday. Joe, that guy right back there, Joe's doing one at his church, Calvary Chapel in Plano. Let me tell you, right now, there's one on Calvary Chapel in Plano. There's one at Grace Bible Church this Saturday. It's from 8:45 to 3, and you get a real taste of these tools, principles, and you're actually going to go share the gospel. By the way, we do this about once a semester here. Dr. Bain brings our team on, and we physically train you in these tools and principles, and then physically take you into the community and do what we call 0 to 1. And so we did one about 3 weeks ago here. Just it's the first tip of the iceberg, so to speak.
So it's 2 this Saturday.
There's 2, yeah. One at Grace Bible Church, which is in Old Dallas Park by Inwood, right off Inwood, by the airport, which is an interesting community. Want to tell you one quick story? All right, I'll tell you. Grace Bible Church, probably one of the wealthiest areas of Dallas. We had a training there a year ago. We sent out teams into the community, very wealthy area. We knocked on the door. I didn't knock on the door when the teams knocked on the door. I won't get into how we actually engage people. It's a whole other talk for another day. Knock on the door, we tell them where we're from, what we're doing, and we're trying to care for people. This team knocks on the door, and this woman comes to the door, and she's highly agitated. And she basically told them, she talks to demons, and the demons told her that they were coming this morning. And the demon told this lady what they had been doing before they came to the training that morning. This is in the real rich area of Dallas. And so she ended up attacking. This is like the 7 Sons of Sceva thing. You guys in Acts? And they attacked the group. This has happened one time in 8 years of sending people out. And so they come back, and I'm thinking they will never want to do this ever again. You know what it did for them? It energized them. And you know what it was? Is because the demons knew who they were, knew they were coming, and warned this lady. Is this not an affirmation of this activity? That the demons even know when we start doing this stuff, and we start, in fact, the red flag goes up. Okay? And that was literally 20 minutes from here in a very wealthy area. We got a lot of stories like that as we send people out. But anyway, guys, I'm done. I appreciate your time.